There is a problem worth considering not only for religious believers, but especially for skeptics, which concerns this issue of God's hiddenness. And I think to put this somewhat paradoxically, the Judeo-Christian tradition relies explicitly on holy scriptures that are supposed to supply us with a kind of special knowledge of God. Although that very revelation which is provided to us nonetheless extends the clarification that this God is a hidden God, as Isaiah 45 says. Now, I myself have always liked the Latin configuration, which I think has had more force behind it, in saying that God is the Deus absconditus, or in English, the absent God. Now, the French philosopher Blaise Pascal once said that Christian belief necessarily includes two elements. First, that God is hidden, and second, that we are corruptible. Moreover, the fact that there is a separation between myself and God doesn't merely suggest that there is a quantitative break, or difference that is, between two entities, but that most radically, instead, there is a qualitative break between two persons. Hence, the reality of God's absence has something more so to do with the moral gravity that surrounds our being significantly separated. And of course, this perhaps may have something to do with the kind of difference of power dynamics between the infinite and the finite. For example, just as a single rot spoils the whole lot, so in the same way impurity and corruptibility spoil the lot of holiness and chastity. The finite, after all, cannot contain the infinite. So perhaps the infinite must either come down to the level of the finite, or the infinite must raise the finite unto itself. However, I think to sidetrack those kinds of more philosophical considerations, I think one way to better illustrate this is first to highlight that we human beings are imitative creatures. Now, interestingly, throughout the medieval period, and of course thereafter, the word ape came to signify a verb which initially meant to imitate or to copy. And so we too, as the biologists tell us, are inspirationally ape-like in this regard of likewise delighting in imitation. The psychologists even tell us this when it comes to early stages of infancy, where we display imitative powers around our environment. One psychologist, for example, ran a famous experiment where he would instruct mothers to interact and play with their children for a short while, only to then suddenly stop and look back at them with no emotion or expression whatsoever on their face. And now the results, of course, were naturally that the children became very upset. And it's more so because, so thought anyway, that the sort of emotional content they were inducing suddenly lost its imitative meaning. And hence there was a way in which they became lost. In the cause and effect relationship of mimicry became broken between child and mother. And now I think only as a possible kind of thought, if you, as a listener, would only permit me this, I wonder in what analogous way this kind of activity of the mother's turning away from the child, if it has any significant relevance to an experience with religious belief in our relationship with God. So, for example, one may consider the sort of intimate, imitative union between God and man in early paradise, where we were initially made in God's image. This sort of scenario where I and thou shared a perfect, reflective kind of relationship. However, over time, once we arrive at the events of Exodus, man starts to display a kind of irritability towards God's distance from him. Moses says in Exodus 33, "Please show me your glory." And God replies, "There is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." Now, this little biblical scene is one which I have played over and over and over again in my head. I really can just only imagine what it must have been like to be in that position. One which is mixed together with all kinds of emotions of wonder, expectation, bewilderment, longing, and perhaps even an irk of irritability, since the anxiety of being away from God's presence was explicitly felt and mentioned to God by Moses. However, one of the things that I think has always stood out to me about this passage is precisely the fact to keep in mind that God does not have a body. Even though we're provided with that anthropomorphic imagery of God having a face, of having a back which to turn to and a hand by which to cover someone, all of these images instead translate to the ways in which we humans understand the I and thou relationship, especially among our intimate relationships with the beloved. Now, that is, we view that I-thou relationship somewhat imperfectly in this life, as Paul says, through a looking glass darkly, catching occasional glimpses and hints of eternity. Much in the same way as an individual who has spent many years in a foreign country will catch sudden glimpses of longing and disquietude when they hear a familiar dialect or smell a long-forgotten aroma. It is not the starry night sky, nor the waves over the blades of grass that contain the eternal, but these are the instances in life in which the eternal is hidden. All of reality, it could be said, is a divine secret, but that secret is God. It's important to keep in mind as to this question of God's hiddenness, that God resides in heaven and we do not. And so in the question, where is God, we must return with the reply that where we are not, but simultaneously there nonetheless exists the possibility of the kingdom of God being within you. But of course, in the meantime, some of us have grown discontent with a prolonged facing the back of God. It is why the Apostle Paul, in one sense, mentions that it is his desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. As Augustine put it, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O Lord. And be it known finally that an authentic seeking for God is one that entails true rest, and not busyness or a restless stirring. As God assures Moses, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. God's presence and our resting is the holy seal of our sacrimony with him. Jesus sets the stage for our hand in marriage when he even bids us, come unto me all who are weary, and I will give you rest. Our presence with God is awaiting. Those of you who think your seeking for God is a tireless, restless, and even reforming sort of thing, be not mistaken. The end of all of our religious striving and our spiritual seeking is precisely only to end in rest.